So you guys remember how it was. Back in the early 90s, if you wanted to play Street Fighter 2 at home, then there was only one console that had it, the Super Nintendo. Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior was an awesome conversion of the biggest game in the world, but around the summer of 1992, there were mutterings of Street Fighter 2 heading elsewhere, namely Sega's super popular Megadrive.
Perfect!
Even more shockingly though, was the rumour that Sega was going one better than Nintendo and had gotten hold of the updated Champion Edition that had recently hit arcades, allowing you to control the bosses, something not available in the SNES version. Whilst the rumours were exciting, it wasn't until pictures of the Megadrive 6-button pad started showing up towards the end of 1992 that the reality of Street Fighter 2 coming to our trusty Segas was really starting to hit home. So my personal journey with Megadrive Street Fighter 2 was one that felt like the longest year of my life from rumour to release. And just to give some context of how significant the release of Street Fighter 2 on the Megadrive was, in a recent exchange with Mean Machines legend Jazz Rignall on Twitter, he concurred with my sentiments about how exciting the game was by saying, "The sheer anticipation for the game was incredible, never really seen anything like it before or since." That's a pretty big statement for a guy who's been in the industry for about 30 years. So with the news of Street Fighter 2 heading Sega's way, and with Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 achieving huge popularity, I had picked up a Megadrive and was really hoping that the Street Fighter news stories were true. I'd initially read that Street Fighter 2 would release on the Megadrive in February 1993, but without a screenshot in sight, it soon became apparent that this was not going to happen. Thankfully, a little game called Streets of Rage 2 helped ease the disappointment, and I'd soon spent my Street Fighter 2 money on picking up a copy of that masterpiece instead. But I couldn't help but wonder where Street Fighter 2 had gotten to, and things had gone a little quiet on that front. That was all until one sunny day I walked into Asda in Brighton and I picked up the May issue of Mean Machines Sega, and I had my mind blown. Street Fighter 2 was on its way, and here it finally was, right before my eyes. My eyes scanned the pages as I tried to absorb every conceivable detail, and upon purchasing the magazine and taking it home, I spent countless hours just staring at their pages in awe. Sure, there were a few oddities, stuff that I chalked up mainly to being early in development and sure that would be ironed out, such as the large black border at the top of the screen housing the energy bars, and the strange renaming of Blanca to Branca was a pretty weird inclusion. But overall, I was just happy to be getting Street Fighter 2 in any iteration after all this time. In the July issue, Mean Machines Sega followed up with a full-on 8-page preview, and I dread to think how many more hours I lost to that article. Seemingly from the same build as last month's news article, we got to see an expanded glimpse of the game, with more characters shown as well as more backdrops. Although the black borders were still present, things were looking good, with detailed characters and well-rendered stages that mirrored their arcade counterparts well. My hype was at fever pitch. However, in a weird twist, this game never ended up actually seeing the light of day and was scrapped by Capcom, and this issue marked the last time that we would see it, at least at the time. Many years later, the game's ROM surfaced again in the form of the Street Fighter 2 Turbo Beta. As it turns out, the project had been outsourced, but upon seeing the results, Capcom pulled the game back in-house so that they could develop it themselves. The blurb on the back of the box of the physical copy I got a hold of explains that 2 decades later, the beta version was discovered and released to the public by an anonymous source. The game seems to be the same game as that used in the early preview shot, but at a further point of development. Gone, for example, are the much maligned black borders in favour of the traditional floating energy bars, and even Blanca has had his regular name restored. There's already a really good video detailing the game's origins by the Nostalgia Nerd, who has made a much better video on the game than I ever would have, so I'll put a link in the description for you to go check that out. But to be brief, despite the Street Fighter 2 Turbo name and the Hyper Fight in alternate colours, this beta version is the undiluted Champion Edition, matching the game in gameplay, speed and characters. In fact, outside of the PC Engine, the game marks the only other time we've seen a dedicated version of Champion Edition on 16-bit consoles. But what happened next then? Well, with some magazines like Sega Power jumping the gun trying to beat the EMAP magazines to the review and reviewing the unfinished Champion Edition, Mean Machine Sega instead waited and ended up breaking the news on what was to become the real Mega Drive version of Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition, or Champion Edition Plus for the Japanese market. With the imminent arrival of the latest version of Street Fighter 2 on the SNES, Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, Sega contacted Capcom to make sure they weren't left in the dust and ensure their version had all the latest enhancements too. Thus, as Nintendo had already sewn up the rights to the name of Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Special Champion Edition was born. Like the Super Nintendo version, there were two versions of Street Fighter 2 on offer. The Champion Edition option, or normal if you're playing on Super Nintendo, offered all of the moves and colours of the coin-up, as you would expect. But the main event was the Hyper Fighting enhancements, available by selecting Hyper on the Mega Drive version or Turbo on the SNES. This was Capcom's answer to some of the bootleg versions of Street Fighter 2 that have been doing the rounds, such as the Rainbow or Black Belt editions, as unbalanced as those games were. Capcom added a slew of new moves, such as aerial hurricane kicks, Chun-Li's new fireball move, and E-Honda's deadly butt slam, all with a quicker lick of pace that really made the game work. I still find that much like back at the time, some people still don't understand that the Mega Drive Special Champion Edition and the Super Nintendo's Turbo are effectively the same game. But it was all good, and with Mean Machine's latest batch of screenshots of the official game showing off the new assets over the scrap Champion Edition, the nervous wait for the review of Special Champion Edition was on. Mean Machine Sega broke the first review with a monster edition of the magazine with the all-important review found in this separate pullout. Having recently returned to school after the summer holiday, I picked up my copy on my walk to morning classes. I somehow resisted tearing into the magazine right there in the street and waited until I got to school, where with a gathered audience waiting for the news, I laid the magazine out before them on the table. We flicked to the final pages of the pullout with nervous excitement for a review score. And what did we find? Bang! It was good news! A whopping 98% overall meant that it was the highest rated Mega Drive game of all time, and I could finally look forward to picking up my own copy on launch day, knowing full well that I'd be getting an excellent conversion of my favourite game. Sure, there was an issue with the quality of the speech samples, but in every single other area the game excelled.
Round one, fight!
In recent years, the sound issue has become a thing of the past thanks to the efforts of Stephane Dellongville, who created a patch to improve the sample qualities and put right the things that Capcom did wrong. As you can hear, he's done an excellent job, so full credit to him.
You win! Perfect!
Anyway, with the review in and with 2 6-button controllers already purchased, the wait for the UK release of Friday the 29th of October 1993 commenced. So it must have been around 6 PM on Thursday 28th, the day before Street Fighter 2's official release, that my mum turned up unexpectedly at my friend and fellow Grigadier's house, Begel of Grigarig. For some reason, she'd been in early to Boots in Eastbourne where we'd pre-ordered the game and was stopping in to deliver me the news that the shop had let her have my copy before Street Day. I couldn't believe it, but even more so, I couldn't believe that she didn't bring the game with her, leaving it instead back at our house. I didn't even wait for her to finish her conversation with Begel's mum before I was already running down the street as fast as I could with the excitement of it all. I burst in the front door of my house and there it was, Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition, just sitting there at the bottom of the stairs. I picked it up and examined it. In a way, I felt like I was holding the whole universe, what with the journey we've been on, condensed down into this simple video game that I was now holding in my hands. Naturally, the awe at this moment was short-lived, and the box was soon flung aside as the cartridge within was torn from it and hastily thrust into my Megadrive. It was all here, the attract sequence from the arcade, the turbo enhancements, the characters, the sound, and more importantly, the gameplay. And man, that gameplay. It was perfect. So perfect in fact, that my recovery from this life-changing game has yet to occur. And even after these additional 25 years, and after every other iteration of the games that I've followed feverishly since, I'm still, above all else, a Street Fighter fan. But it was all here with my Megadrive version that I really found my place, and for that I will always remember the game and the buzz of the journey to Special Champion Edition.